Ottoman and Byzantine Military Postures, The Conquest of Constantinople Part 2, Episode 25.
The aforementioned impious emperor of the Turks attacked the city, destroyed the vineyards, plundered the suburbs, murdered many people, and spilled as much blood as possible both on this occasion and a little earlier. Then he went away in order to make preparations, it has been said, to lay siege to Constantinople the next spring with every imaginable piece of artillery and siege engine. This city could expect help neither from within nor from without. Neither funds nor men were available, as the city has been tortured for a long time by its great poverty, lack of men, attacks by the enemy, and by fear and bitter reckoning of what is in store for us. Our only hopes are the merciful and compassionate God, should he return, spare and defend us. Have mercy upon us, and save us from bitter slavery to the impious Turks, as he delivered the Israelites and drowned the men of the Pharaoh.
We left off in Part 1 with the completion of the Ottoman fortress erected just north of Constantinople. And what you had just heard in the beginning was a contemporaneous first-hand account of Mehmed and his entourage stopping off in the suburbs of Constantinople to raid, test, and feel out the defenses of the great city after his completion of the fortress. You can feel the agony of Theodorus, the chronicler of these sad events, narrated for us by Soren Narnia of Knife Point Horror Podcast, as the Ottomans began their first of three massive psychological blows to the citizens of the great city. Mehmed didn't, at that time, possess a force strong enough to take the city outright, but he wanted to send a message to the inhabitants that they were without hope. Nobody was coming to save the great city, and the Emperor Constantine XI was powerless to stop the Sultan. Three great psychological blows would scourge the minds of the citizens of Constantinople that would foreshadow the fall and doom of their city. The first blow landed after the record completion time of the Ottoman fortress and the subsequent raid on the suburbs of Constantinople. The second blow struck the hearts when the Ottoman navy appeared outside the city and initiated a phase blockade. And lastly, in April of 1453, came the appearance of the Ottoman army, which would be the final psychological blow. Sultan Mehmed II, after delivering his first psychological blow, decided upon a meandering long march on his way up to the Ottoman capital of Edirne. Mehmed, always on the move, wanted to inspect the preparations for the siege of Constantinople that was taking place in the various parts of his empire. His first stop-off point was at Gallipoli, where he inspected his newly completed navy. For a long time, the Ottomans had been hampered by lack of control of not just the Straits, but the Aegean, Black Sea, and Eastern Mediterranean areas. This episode's blog spot, available on the website ottomanempirepodcast.com, link in the show notes provided. I have put up a map of the Ottoman Empire as it was just on the eve of the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. If you take a look at the map, the Ottomans controlled large swaths of Anatolia, and they had pushed deep into European Balkans. This extended the coastlines, which were dotted with large towns that also possessed important harbors and served as economic engines for first the Byzantines, and then later whatever principality, kingdom, or region exerted control. Control of the coastland would be a project for another day, but the shipyards at Gallipoli weren't just built for the siege of the great city. Even as far back as Mehmed's first reign in the 1440s, our young leader was envisioning a world in which the Ottomans would dominate the entire Mediterranean basin. Staffing his navy proved difficult, however, and the Sultan recruited widely, and his agents returned with aspiring sailors from not only the Middle East, but as well as the West, to include Italy and Spain as well. These Christians serving in the Ottoman navy, if captured by a rival Christian force, were often tortured and executed in some of the most brutal and inhumane methods imaginable. So bad, in fact, I'd have to give this podcast an explicit rating if I were to even mention them. Leading Mehmed's navy was his longtime friend and sometimes mentor, Hamza Bey, a dude who could probably use his very own extra special sometime in the future on this podcast. Mehmed managed to build up his navy to some 100 light galleys and stationed 30 at the mouth of the straits near Gallipoli to block off any incoming Christian vessels, and stationed the remaining forces at the entrance of the Bosporus leading to and from the Black Sea and also around Constantinople itself. His fortress of Rumeli Hasar, plus the appearance of the Ottoman naval squadrons, which attempted to intercept the ships coming and going from the great city, caused a massive drop in Byzantine morale over the next couple of months. The Ottoman navy's success during the conquest of Constantinople would be a mixed bag. We will hear about Venetian, Genoese, and other navies successfully running Mehmed's blockade, and although ship for ship, sailor for sailor, the Christian navies were superior to anything the Ottomans had managed to put to sea by 1453, the message to the West was clear, that in a decade or so, the Ottomans were going to be poised to take on the Christian mastery of the Mediterranean head-on. For our citizens of the great city, it was to be the second psychological blow I mentioned earlier. Although a few Christian ships slipped in and out of the city, the appearance of over 50 Ottoman vessels must have been daunting. After appointing the capable Hamza Bey as Grand Admiral of the Navy, Mehmed headed up and then west into Thrace and deeper into Greece. He let loose his Akinci warriors to raid and pillage the parts of Greece still nominally a part of the Byzantine Empire. In October of 1452, Mehmed summoned the competent Turkhan Beg to his tent. He invested him in extra powers and authority for the sole purpose of securing his western flank against any Christian counterattack that was meant to relieve the upcoming siege at Constantinople. This meant raising troops, reorganizing the Sapiha cavalry, and garrisoning forts along the Greek Peloponnese in order to block the two brothers of the Emperor Constantine XI, whose names were Thomas and Demetrius, from coming up from southern Greece and flanking the Ottomans and helping to aid their brother. Mehmed also made sure the governor-general of all Rumelia, which, if we remember, is the European Balkans under Ottoman control, a guy by the name of Karaka Pasha, was hard at work reinforcing the roads all over the empire so that troops, the heavy cannons, and logistics would not be delayed as the Ottoman military machine converged on Constantinople. Now fully settled in Edirne by November of 1452, Sultan Mehmed made final preparations. Kendarli Pasha, by this point, and it's worth mentioning what he's been up to, was made to publicly support Mehmed's dream of conquering Constantinople. And if you'll recall in part 1, he was even forced to pay for the construction of one of the towers at the fortress of Rumeli Hasar. The wily old Pasha had learned that direct disobedience to Mehmed at this point could lose one's head. However, behind the scenes, Kendarli was working to sow discontent and undermine the headstrong and young sultan wherever he could. But this old strategy was proving a bit difficult these days. Kendarli's grandfather, and also vizier of the sultans, had been a forward-thinking advisor and reformer. It was Kendarli's grandfather who had helped usher in the age of the Devshirme slave system, or blood tribute of slaves, and he may even have had a hand in forming the Janissaries themselves. As I've said in previous episodes, what was supposed to be lower-level administrative jobs nobody wanted, or jobs that were simply dangerous, like being a Janissary. The slave tribute system in the empire had seen men of Christian background rise up to challenge the establishment of the old guard Turkish families. But times were a-changing, as they say. The Janissaries, after having their ranks purged of malcontents and lazy bums, weren't as receptive to offers of bribery from the old guard. And the influx of new recruits into the corps meant that avenue of potentially deadly chaos for Mehmed was now firmly shut off. If you guys head on over and watch the Netflix special on the Conquest of Constantinople, Kendarli is portrayed as having ties to the Byzantine court and worked to subvert Ottoman efforts from that angle. Now, I think that's one hell of a stretch. Not only would word have reached Sultan Mehmed that, hey, your Grand Vizier is running around having all these secret meetings with an Eastern Roman Grand Duke, but it would have meant Kendarli was literally risking his entire family line being perished. Increasingly, therefore, Kendarli found himself isolated, and even the old scions in the old guard were slowly, one by one, beginning to come around to Mehmed's dreams of conquest for the empire. Soon, all Kendarli could do was sit back and participate in Mehmed's preparations for war. And that leads us to the third psychological blow to befall the citizens of Constantinople, the appearance in April of 1453, the full might of the Ottoman war machine. In February of 1453, just a few months prior, the Emperor Constantine XI attempted one final peace gesture to the Ottomans, and a delegation was sent out from Constantinople, headed up to Edirne, to address the Sultan. Their diplomatic exchange was poised in a careful tone, and it went like this.
Since you have chosen war, and I can persuade you neither by flattery nor by your sown treaty, do as you please. I will seek shelter with God. If it is his will to hand this city into your hands, who will be able to oppose him? If again he inspires peace in your heart, I will gladly welcome it. For the time being, take back your treaty and your sworn statements. From this point on, I will close the gates of the city, and I will provide protection to the inhabitants. Do go on with your oppressive rule until the righteous judge will deliver his just verdict to each man, to you and to me.
Sultan Mehmed was having none of it, though. He sent the delegations on back to Constantinople with a message to their emperor to prepare for war. Before we get into the size, units, and composition of Mehmed's army, which showed up outside the city gates, let us first stop on over in Constantinople, and let's see what the situation looks like from their very unenviable position, and learn a bit about the history of past sieges. The city of Constantinople served as an imperial capital for the Roman Empire since 330 AD. Over 11 centuries, the city had weathered 25 sieges. Of those 25, only once did the city fall to an outside invading non-Roman force, and this would be the Crusaders in 1204. Nobody since, aside from internal Roman civil wars, had been successful in taking the city. Mehmed's conquest would end up being the eventual and final number 26. The Constantinople of 1453 was not the same as it had been in the past. Its inner walls were in poor shape, and most sad of all was the massive depopulation which had occurred over the past centuries. But these were especially accelerated after the Ottoman Civil War period of Mehmed I. This depopulation meant the emperor didn't have much of a tax base to pay his soldiers, engineers, and specialists, the kind of guys you were going to need if you hoped to survive a siege. It also meant that the only source of treasure and money was the Orthodox Church and its monasteries, and all of this proved to be a deadly combination. The low population also meant that the once great city was really just a series of small villages just behind the great Theodosian walls, with the rich focused in the center with their grand estates. The walls couldn't be fully covered with soldiers. Outside the city, there were a few areas scattered here and there, proclaiming some connection with the Byzantine Empire. First, we have the, quote, Empire of Trebizond, located in northeastern section of Anatolia. And this area was totally cut off from helping the city in any kind of way. The entity was more like one of the imperial remnants from the Star Wars legends. Having been lost during the Latin conquest, they never quite returned to the imperial fold. The Black Sea region was dotted here and there with a few colonies of Greeks, and on the Greek peninsula, Constantinople possessed nominal authority at best. All these territories would be eventually gobbled up by the Ottomans in the next decade, forever erasing any vestige of the Byzantine Empire forever. As we learned in part 1, Western support was short in coming, because during this time there was a whole lot going on in Europe. Spain was undergoing the Reconquista, France and England were embroiled in the 100 Years' War. Over in the Holy Roman Empire was consumed with internal fighting, and the Hungarians and Poles, well, they had lost first at Varna and then at the Second Battle of Kosovo, and nobody had the stomach for another tussle with the Ottomans. However, despite the Western Europeans' very heavily loaded table, a few crumbs did fall into Emperor Constantine's hands. Most notably, 6 military contingents, which ended up bolstering the morale and effectiveness of the city's defenses. First was a Catholic cardinal named Isidore, funded by the Pope. He arrived in Constantinople in late 1452 with over 200 archers. This was significant because, although more a political gesture than anything else, well, at the end of the day, 200 archers are 200 archers. Plus, it meant the Catholic Church was, at least in spirit, no pun intended, supporting their Orthodox brother Christians in the coming struggle. Second, you had various units of Italian mercenaries, paid for by the leaders of Western Europe, arriving in mixed matches and batches of a few dozens or by their hundreds. Third, despite their recent treaty with the Ottoman Empire, arrived a squadron of ships from Venice who offered their support to Emperor Constantine XI. Fourth, Pope Nicholas ordered 3 ships laden with provisions to be sent to Constantinople, and this group set sail at the end of March in 1453. Fifth would come the powerful Duke of Venosa, along with the Count. They arrived with 200 archers, and both these guys and along with their men would die in the fighting. Apparently, they owed a debt to the Catholic Church, which the Pope promised would all be repaid upon the conclusion of their service to Constantinople. Sixth and final. Any history buff familiar with the conquest or fall, whatever your choice and poison of Constantinople, has undoubtedly heard of the legendary and sometimes scandalous figure of the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, and I pray and hope I am pronouncing the good commander's last name correctly. Giovanni arrived with a force of some 700 men, and so awesome was his reputation as a military commander that Emperor Constantine immediately granted him, very literally, the keys to the city by elevating him to the rank of protostrator and supreme commander of all of Constantinople's military forces. Born in 1418, Giovanni was a Genoese nobleman and member of the House of Doria. Obtaining fame and fortune during his day, he was known as a mercenary, warrior, and also an ardent soldier for Catholicism, an ever defender of Genoese interests across the entire Mediterranean basin. When he heard of the plight of Constantinople, he, along with a trusted subordinate, made for the city, taking with him some of the very best 700 warriors he could find. He arrived in January of 1453, and he, along with his 700 troops, provided a massive morale boost for the citizens. And he quickly went about to reorganize the Byzantine defenses. He conscripted every able-bodied male he could find, and he put them on the city walls. This meant scouring the monasteries for young men and old who were in good enough shape to hold a sword or a lance, and then pressing them into military service, a move which angered the Patriarch of Constantinople greatly. However, with the arrival of Giovanni, the Patriarch would have further cause for gripe in the coming months. The women and children, too, he organized into battalions. These units proved invaluable, for when it came to countermines being dug, material carried to the wall for repairs, food and water, and generally taking care of the logistics for the defenders, these citizen battalions would work day in and day out, supporting the defenses of the city, motivated by the grim realization of the fate which awaited each of them if the Ottomans were to win. Giovanni's defense strategy, after fully mobilizing the citizens, was to place all the soldiers on the outer Theodosian walls. From there he hoped the city could stand against the Ottomans. All in all, by the time Mehmed arrived in April, Emperor Constantine XI had scrambled together roughly 7,000 to 9,000 troops. The emperor, realizing that the Ottomans had a navy now, ordered a large chain to be dragged across the mouth of the Golden Horn, and this would prevent naval vessels from entering the seaside of the city. Now that we've covered, and I know this was by no means an exhaustive list of the preparations, layout, or details, some of which you can catch in the blog post for this episode, it's now time for us to take a look and see what our 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II was bringing with him to Constantinople when he showed up on April the 6th. The first thing we need to get off the table is the size of the Ottoman army, which besieged and then conquered Constantinople. If you look at contemporaneous sources, they put the Ottoman army at an absurd number, something like 200,000. I've even seen 300,000 floated about. But I don't think that there's any way the Ottomans could have cobbled together an army of that size and maintained them in the field as long as they did. Even up till the 1950s, in the field of Ottoman studies, it was thought that Mehmed possessed numbers somewhere in the 180,000 plus range. Not till recent times and re-examination of the primary source material, which is a topic way too big for this podcast. And to be quite honest, there's another podcast which you probably know about on the Ottoman Empire that can cover this a whole lot better than I can. But it wasn't until after the 1950s that we began to get a more accurate idea of what Mehmed was up to. All accounts do agree on one thing, however. Mehmed's army was bigger than anything seen in Europe, and by Middle Eastern standards, Although the Islamic world had seen larger armies, it was quite impressive. From the research I've done in preparation for this episode, I will safely put Mehmed's army at a comfortable 90,000 to 120,000 actual fighting men. I think some of the confusion comes from the fact that Mehmed had a ton, and I mean probably over 100,000, civilian camp followers everywhere he went. They could range from their small groups to large groups, but right outside of Constantinople, there was definitely not less than 90,000 of them. So, Frank, enough about the source material and these numbers. What kind of units were in the Ottoman military and how many? I'm glad you asked. A sizable contingent of Mehmed's army was supplied by the region surrounding the Ottoman Empire, and not under their direct control, who had been turned into vassals. These areas included parts of Albania, Serbia, and portions of Anatolia. These areas were forced to supply money, troops. As far as the army went, Serbia, a Christian nation, was forced to supply 1,500 mine sappers, and these guys were considered specialists and elite of their day, and they were handsomely paid, along with some 800 cavalry units. I'm not going to break down the various other units from the other countries and vassal states, but we're going to total them around 8,000 to 10,000 men and cavalry. There were also a huge number of mercenary units from not only the Middle East but also Europe. The European mercenaries carried with them special skills, such as being able to fight in a siege, working with cannons, naval skills, and other roles. These guys really didn't mind fighting against fellow Christians to make a fast buck either. Our mercenary and volunteer units from the Middle East hailed from as far as Persia and North Africa. I think these guys were totaled in around 30,000. Mehmed and his generals were distrustful of mercenaries and the riffraff from Europe and the Middle East. He therefore had their numbers, along with the exceptions of the skilled mine sappers, broken up into smaller numbers to serve as supporting units for his more full-time and loyal soldiers. Next up on the list were the Sipahi cavalry. These guys really deserve their very own extra episode, such as the one I did on the Akinci. But Mehmed had, I guess, 15 or 25,000. The source material is extremely vague and varied on this matter. The Sipahi were the light cavalry units of the Ottoman Empire, as we all know, and Mehmed broke them up into 4 groups. 2 he used to screen the flanks of the Ottoman army, just in case a surprise Christian force showed up out of nowhere. The other 2 he positioned outside the perimeter of the Ottoman camp itself. Gathering the top leaders of the Sipahi, Mehmed explained to them he wanted any deserters hanged and malcontents and rule breakers to be punished severely. The Sipahi would serve as his reinforcement of discipline and order throughout the Ottoman camp. And fulfill this role perfectly the Sipahi did. During the middle of the siege, when things were looking bleak for the Ottomans, the presence of the Sipahi just over the horizon and the sound of their thundering hoofs drove home the message to the common Ottoman soldier that there was only one way out, over the walls of Constantinople. Now, we arrive at the classical contingents of the Ottoman military, and my favorite to research and write about. Our full-time professional troops of the Sultan's new order, called the Kapikulu. Its members, with a few notable exceptions, were all products of the Ottomans' now 100-year-old Dervish system, the forcible recruitment of Christian boys from their conquered territories. The boys would be gathered up from their families when they were of the ages 8 and 18. Then they would be sent to a farm deep in Anatolia, and it was there that they would learn Turkish, convert to Islam, work hard, and be fed a steady diet of high protein and fats to ensure they grew up to become big and really strong. At 12 or 14 years old, the lads would be sent to either Gallipoli or Edrine for evaluations. It was here that the smartest kids would be selected to enter the elite colleges and then graduate as the empire's top-level advisors, administrators, and servants for the sublime Porte. These young men were often physically big, converts to Islam with no familial ties to the Turkish subjects around them, fiercely intelligent and competitive, and absolutely loyal to the Sultan. Their social status was technically that of slave, hence they could not inherit lands, nor pass them on to their sons or obtain social status. But these rules were substantially relaxed, and more than a few capis were elevated to the social and military rank of pasha. There were also a near constant conflict with the old guard like Kendarli, who feared, hated, and loathed these men. And they were men who were initially supposed to occupy the posts the elites didn't want. But the elites like Kendarli were now being pushed out. It should be noted that a mere fraction of the boys selected for duty in the Sultan's household and top administrative post would make this cut. The rest, still impressively talented, smart, and ambitious in their own right, would end up joining the elite professional full-time soldiering roles of the Ottoman Empire. Amongst the most elite were the Ortakas. This was the general staff of support officers, guys in charge of logistics, planning, military intelligence. And there was a battalion of these guys that often traveled ahead of the main army to select suitable campsites. They would also oversee construction of the Grand Vizier and Sultan's tents. They would also establish connections in the surrounding villages in order to make sure that there were supplies. And they did all the complicated and inglorious jobs that never quite make it into those flashy YouTube videos. Of course, there were the most flashy of them all, the Janissaries. Now, their numbers at Constantinople is hard to pin down. Some have them at 10,000, others at 20,000. I think both of these are a bit on the high side. Janissaries were recruited from the kids aged 12 or 14. They would then undergo an intensive training course at Edrine and in Anatolia, which would last an astounding 10 years. Not till a Janissary was 23 or 25 years old, and he had served in a campaign or seen a battle, could he call himself a member that was in full standing. However, during Mehmed's day, he had first purged their ranks and then rebuilt them back up with his hand-selected guards from Anatolia. He kept the very best veterans who had served under Murad II, and in 1451, he found that he didn't really have enough dudes to go around. So he rapidly expanded the Dervshirme system, and for a brief period of time, he opened the ranks of the Janissaries to any able-bodied and single male, where he personally developed a shortened training program, only a year for the new blood. Despite his best efforts to expand them, he would run into some problems. First, the Ottoman Empire, although rich by standards of the day, well, they weren't that rich. To feed, house, supply, train, and pay a standing army is expensive by any measure. Second, Mehmed could give all the orders he wanted from either Gallipoli, Edrine, or Bersha, or wherever he happened to be galloping around. And although his reputation was preceding him, often his orders would fall on deaf ears, get lost, or simply ignored. It was the nature of the times. The result was that Mehmed's Janissaries numbered, and I'm being generous here, around 8,000. I don't believe the accounts for 1 minute that put them higher than 10,000 or 15,000. There's simply nothing to substantiate those claims. Next up in the magazine well of the Ottoman military machine were the Lakshmi. These guys were employed part-time as mine sappers. As mentioned earlier, the Serbian contingent of sappers were highly paid and very professional men. The military strategy of digging a tunnel underneath an enemy's walled fortification and then leaving gunpowder inside to blow it up and subsequently bring the whole wall come crashing down was a tried and true tactic. The movies depicting this often show the mine diggers as second-class soldiers or as a form of punishment, but this was far from the truth. The sappers had a dangerous job, and the officers and leaders wanted to reward them for their hard work. As such, Ottoman sappers often enjoyed first-class tents, double rations, higher pay, and the strict discipline that was enforced on the rest of the camp was often relaxed for these very brave and highly skilled men. Next, we have the Ottoman Artillery Corps, mainly composed of foreigners on salary by the Sultan, but later their own native Turkish specialists would step in and fill this role. This was the branch that Orban, the Hungarian and legendary cannon maker, belonged to. They were left alone, paid very well, and the massive cannons they lugged down from Medrine had to have special bridges, wheels, and logs to transport them. These guys were up day and night. By day, they fired their massive cannons, reloaded, cleaned, and then had to service their massive weapons. By night, they had to work on the logistical and maintenance side of things. And their leader also probably had to explain to Mehmed, who would have been furiously pacing around in his tent, all pissed off, why the walls were still holding up. Worth mentioning, too, were the Sultan's Imperial Guard, composed of elite cavalry units called the Kapikulu Servali Ko Akshki, which literally translates to the hearth of the cavalrymen of the gates of slaves, was first founded by Murad I. The first regiment was manned by the slave system Devshirme, composed of the biggest, baddest, smartest kid the system could produce. These guys hung out with the Sultan, accompanied him on his hunts, and guarded him everywhere he went. They numbered around 300 to 500 during Mehmed's day. During the later period of Mehmed's reign, a second regiment was established, called the Salandur. This formation was manned by the Ottoman ruling establishment and elites, and membership was a highly sought-after prize for centuries to come. All in all, I'd say Mehmed had a grand total of 8,000 Janissaries, 9,000 supporting troops in his Kapikulu. The irregular forces were obviously way more numerous. The Akinci were simply uncountable, and who knows how many of them were there, but they were there. They were kept under check by Mehmed, who was coming to rely more and more upon the disciplined Sapahi during the siege. When we tally up everything, here's what we're looking at. About 800 cavalry from Serbia, along with 1,500 sappers. I'm looking at about 10,000 additional tributary troops from the borders all over the empire, 30,000 mercenary and volunteer units from Europe and the Middle East. As I said before, we're not really sure, 15,000, 25,000 Sapahi cavalry, 9,000 in the Oracus general staff and supporting units, 8,000 Janissaries, and 500 of the Sultan's personal imperial guard, and also 45,000 Azab infantry /archers /lancers, for a grand total of, let me check my calculator, 118,000 troops. Now, you might ask, Frank, how accurate are your figures? I'm going to put my confidence at about 60%. As I said before, the source material is all over the place, and to be honest, the works by historians that really dig into this kind of thing, their books are simply out of my price range in this day and time. Thus it was in April of 1453 that the Ottoman military machine camped outside the gates of Constantinople. The siege would officially get started on April the 6th, and that is when we will pick up in part 3 of the Conquest of Constantinople series. I'd like to add a brief note before we end here, and that's that, well, this series has taken way more time and effort than I had initially budgeted for. With that being said, I am working hard to get these episodes out, so please don't go anywhere. But don't be surprised if there is a delay in releases. Thank you, and I hope to see you around.